The Legend of Zelda, The War of Imprisonment, Chapter 3, Hope Fades. Through the rest of the night, the Marshal and his men diligently searched the entire castle, cornering several of Ganondorf's followers. Hopelessly outnumbered, the Gerudo refused to be taken alive and continued to fight to the bitter end. As a heavy rainstorm poured down into the courtyard, the Marshal met with his captains to assess their situation. Reports from some of the wounded, brought in from the capital city, confirmed that Ganondorf had fought his way out in the chaos and chased Impa past Lon Lon Ranch. The men believed that Impa had managed to lose him. "The castle is secure, and our princess needs us," shouted the Marshal. "Gather our knights. Call for the militia. We're going after Ganondorf." A few minutes later, as the storm cleared over the castle and the moon rose high into the night sky, riders sped out to every corner of the kingdom. "The king is dead. Princess Zelda has fled into hiding. All sons of Hyrule, take up arms and defend your kingdom." By dawn, the Marshal managed to gather and outfit a small company of his knights. Heavily armed and equipped with the finest armor in the kingdom, they were the elite of the king's army. "We can waste no more time. We must ride to the aid of our princess. The rest of you, muster the army and defend the capital. We will send further orders when we can." As they mounted their horses and made for the castle's gates, a violent earthquake rocked the courtyard, and an echoing boom rolled up from the south. "Goddess, save us," whispered the Marshal as he spurred his horse to a gallop toward the city road. Turning the corner and sprinting into the fountain courtyard of the town, Link passed bewildered townsfolk who stared in horror at the black fog that flooded out from the Temple of Time, enveloping the grounds around it. Harsh cries and strange growls could be heard from unseen creatures within the shadow as it washed over the nearest shops and moved to consume the entire town. The Marshal's company rode in from the castle road and turned to meet this strange threat. "All women and children to your homes! All men take up arms!" cried the Marshal, drawing his sword. His eyes quickly scanned the crowd. "That sorcerer is here somewhere," he angrily thought to himself. But as he searched, his eyes found Link, standing behind the city fountain and clutching a brilliant sword. That sword! He had seen it before, in tapestries within the castle. "It cannot be," he thought. "If the sword has been drawn, then that means—" The Marshal turned his eyes back to the menacing black cloud and the tall spires of the temple that still stood in the light. He had always heard tales at court of the golden power, of the sacred realm, and of the mythical master sword that guarded the way. Could it all be true? Many townsfolk ran screaming for the city gates and out over Hyrule's fields, but a small band of brave men took up staves or daggers and fell in behind the Marshal's knights. The cloud swept over the entire town and brought near complete darkness. At once, the men began to feel its effect. Weapons became heavy and hands shook with a sudden weakness. It was more than a shadow. It brought sickness and fear. The Marshal shook his head and strained his eyes into the blackness. "Steel yourselves, men. Don't let some trickster's magic get the best of you," though it took great effort for him to say it in a firm voice. Soon, points of orange light began to appear near the temple way and move quickly down the steps toward the company. The first few quickly multiplied into a menacing orange glow in the darkness. The rhythmic tramp of feet on stone and the ring of steel warned of the coming attack. "Stand ready!" cried the Marshal. "Here they come!" Link, crouched behind the fountain, watched as a wave of burning arrows shot out of the darkness and struck the mounted knights. Many lifted their shields and deflected the deadly bolts, but several of the knights' horses screamed and collapsed to the ground. Then the first wave emerged from the shadow and came into view. They were vicious-looking creatures, heavily built and in the form of men, but their faces were twisted into that of wild boars, and their hands were cruelly strong claws. They carried swords, axes, and spears, and seemed to give no regard for their own safety as they threw themselves against the Hylian host. The marshal cried, "For the goddess!" and charged directly into them, slashing and stabbing as many as he could, crying to his men to follow. At first, the battle seemed to go well. The heavy plate armor of the knights easily turned sword and spear, and the hideous creatures were either killed or driven back to the temple gates. The men cheered as fear seemed to shrink at the prospect of a quick victory, but when the company approached the doors to the Temple of Time, a new form appeared from inside the temple. A tall man, with his face hidden behind an emerald scarf and low hood. He stepped into the open and raised both hands. The marshal rode right up to him, raised his sword to strike. A bright flash stung Link's eyes as great bolts of lightning broke through the ranks of Hyrule's finest knights. Many fell dead, including the gallant marshal. "Tremble, you pathetic fools, and bow before your god Ganon!" cried the sorcerer as he lowered his hands and stepped to the side of the temple gate. The army of monsters grunted and growled in satisfaction at the dead knights. Several even rushed forward to claw and chew at the smoking flesh of the dead. Another furious roar and violent quake ripped through the temple as all but the sorcerer were thrown to the ground. Aghanim touched his hand to his temple and closed his eyes. "As you will, my lord," he muttered a moment later. "What do I do? What do I do?" whimpered Link, tears streaming from his eyes. He was shaking all over, and his throat was choked tight. He had fought formidable beasts, but these were like men. But they ate the flesh of the fallen, and that sorcerer, he cut down so many knights with just a wave of his hand. "The sword!" squeaked Navi. "Use the sword! It is blessed by the goddess to defeat all evil." Link looked down at the sword in his arms. Watching the battle unfold outside the temple, he had completely forgotten that he was still holding it. Even in this dense shadow, it seemed to shine dimly, almost with a light of its own. As he stared at it, his fear subsided, and a warm courage began to take its place. Zelda and Impa had told him of the Master Sword's fabled power, and he had drawn it from the stone. The veiled sorcerer cast the dead aside with a wave of his arm and advanced on the few remaining knights. Several bravely tried to fight him, but each blade passed through him without harm, as though he were made of smoke. He easily killed all those who challenged him. With a wave of his hand, he would burn them with lightning, or guide fallen weapons with invisible hands to strike them. The last few knights backed against a storefront and were encircled by Ganon's monsters. The sorcerer grinned, and his evil eyes flashed. "My lord has made this far too easy," when a small voice spoke behind them. Go back! Go back where you came from!" The wizard and his guard turned to find Link, brandishing an oversized sword at them next to the city fountain. "What is this?" laughed the wizard as he waved his guard aside and approached the child himself. "The boy," a terrible voice growled from the temple. "Kill the boy." Aghanim's laughter died at once, and his voice grew solemn. He bowed his head, answering, "As you command, my lord," and locked his eyes on Link. Link's hands shook, but he planted his feet firmly. "I said go back where you came from," he shouted. Aghanim slowly raised his hand, palm up, toward the sky. Several fallen swords and spears were lifted from the ground and hurled themselves toward Link. Unable to dodge so many, Link threw himself to the ground behind a pile of the fallen monsters. Aghanim stepped closer, continuing to raise and throw weapons, shields, and even the bodies of the dead at the boy. When the wizard stood over him, Link thrust the Master Sword out and tried to stab him. Aghanim easily turned aside, dodging the attack, and struck Link across the face, knocking him back to the ground. The Master Sword slipped from Link's hands and clattered on the hard stones below. "What can a man do against the power of my god?" mused Aghanim as he stood over Link. "What can a boy do with just a sword?" he asked as he reached to take the sword. Link dove for the hilt, but Aghanim's fingers closed around it first. "Ah!" He screamed as a boiling hiss came from the sword's grip, and a brilliant flash of white light lit the town square. The sorcerer dropped the sword and clutched at his wounded hand. It was now badly burned, the flesh blackened and cracked. "Fool!" roared Ganon. "Kill the boy, now!" As the sorcerer recoiled, Link swiftly crawled after the sword and closed his hands around its grip. Aghanim unleashed his full power, mercilessly enveloping Link with his lightning. Link's mind went completely blank, and his body was filled with agony as he screamed in pain. The sorcerer's eyes were filled with murderous hatred as he poured all of his power into this attack. "Die, boy! Die and bother me no more!" But the wizard's hate had distracted him from those few remaining knights that held out nearby. Ganon's soldiers had been blinded by the flash of light from the Master Sword and staggered back, leaving an opening for the king's men. The marshal's lieutenant had seen Link fall and dashed towards Aghanim. With the wizard distracted and keeping no magic to protect himself, the knight swung his heavy mace and smashed it into Aghanim's side. The lightning broke and flickered out as the sorcerer collapsed to the ground, clutching at his crushed ribs. His eyes bulging in terror, Aghanim choked out, "Save me, my lord! Save me!" The knights of Hyrule gathered around their lieutenant as Aghanim faded and disappeared from sight. Ganon's army now charged forward and crashed against the knight's shield wall. The lieutenant quickly lifted Link onto his shoulder and, wrapping his hand in his own cape, lifted the Master Sword by the blade. Beckoning to his comrades to cover his escape, he leapt on one of the few remaining horses left alive and fled south through the city gates. The remaining knights fought on to a heroic, but ultimately fatal, end. As the lieutenant cleared the gate and rode out over Hyrule's northern plains, a terrific explosion finally destroyed the magnificent Temple of Time. The towers and spires collapsed into the rising flame and shadow and was lost to view. All that remained standing was the broken wall that had once held the Door of Time, now a dark portal connecting Hyrule to the Dark Realm. Though his menacing power poured into Hyrule, Ganon still could not force his way through. He was still struggling against Hylia's power and could not bring himself physically into Hyrule. He would have to find another way into the world of light. End of Chapter 3.